Okay, so now we're going to take a look at basically baking this out, which will allow us to improve scene efficiency and really boost up uh, or reduce render time, so boosting the speed overall of everything. What we're going to do is render out the noise, the function that is creating the altitude. And from there, we can create different variations to render out depending on the type of controls you want to have. Depending on if you're going to be using, or if you're proficient in an image editing application like Photoshop, it makes things much easier. There's a lot more you can do with it. So let's take a look at creating a scene specifically for setting this up. What I'm going to do is copy this terrain, create a new scene, or actually, just to get the default sky, I'm going to go ahead and close this current scene, create a new one, and paste in that terrain. If you have problems with that technique, what you can do is just save out the object, so save the terrain, or save out the function. I just want to do this in a different scene so that I can use it universally to take any function, paste it into what I currently have. What we can do is reset the material. We don't need to have the material anymore unless you want to render out the material version. In that case, I probably should have saved that. But really, we can just modify it in an image editor, doing basically the same thing, and a lot quicker and easier without having to re-render. So the whole point of this is to get the altitude and that noise function out. So what we want to do is add in an object that is going to have a material of this function. So we will add in, let's go ahead and use a cube. If you're using version 7 and up, you can just directly connect, add in input node external dependency in the object graph, so editing the graph of the cube to open this up. Right click, add input node external dependency, select the terrain size, and connect the size to that external dependency. Switch to true dimensions. Actually, that might not be applicable to this. It looks like that matched up correctly. And we're just going to place that above the terrain. If you're using version 5 or 6, you can set up some manual numeric values to match. So in other words, going to the procedural terrain size and copying, pasting that over. Now the reason I'm doing this, even though we're in the parametric mode, so it technically doesn't really matter what size the cube is. If we were in the world mode, it would be important, which is why I think it's a good idea just to have it sized. What we're going to do is switch over to the top camera, which is the secondary camera in the scene, and we're just going to move it out and switch our render settings. I'm just going to go to the final mode, render to screen, and switch this over to square aspect ratio. I don't have my frame guide showing, so I will, or I can bring them up, but because this is a square, as long as the top and bottom are centered, it should be okay, but left and right, just to make sure. What I can do, I'll go ahead and turn those on. So display the framing strips, and you can match this if you want. One thing I would suggest, just in case, is to move the camera out a bit and zoom in, just in case there's any perspective problems. Because this cube is flat, there shouldn't be any problems, although the sides of the cube could interfere. It's just a little precaution. So now what we want to do is go to the procedural terrain, and we're going to edit the object, edit the function, and now we do have that primary output of the custom dependency already in there. So if you don't have that final dependency output included, you can add output node custom dependency. Version 5 and 6 users will need to copy the altitude production and paste it into the color production in the advanced material editor. So that will basically give us kind of the same thing, but making sure you are on the other object. And depending on which version of Vue you have and if the option is available, we have the ability to ignore the atmosphere and ignore the lighting, which is going to be really important. If you are using version 5 or 6, then what you want to do is switch the atmosphere over to the environment mapping, and under the sky fog and haze tab, or the fog and haze tab, make sure there is no fog and no haze. Also, you want to open the light, the sunlight, and turn off shadows. Then, going back to the material, and I'm just going to check those, ignore settings off for the moment. You want to turn the diffuse down to 0 and the luminous up to 100%. And that will give you what we're about to see once I make this connection. So right now, turn the luminous off. Diffuse doesn't really matter because we're ignoring all these settings. We're going to go to edit the material function, add in input node external dependency, and now we're going to select that procedural terrain and its dependency. Also, once again, really important, especially when you're rendering this out, you do need to be between -1 and 1. You can do this whether in the material editor or before the custom dependency output. It is extremely important that this is done in order for it to work correctly. Otherwise, things are going to be cut out and clipped. So what we can do now with that intensity is just delete the color information and directly connect the color to that external dependency, making sure that our mapping mode is set to object standard and identical in size to whatever we have for the terrain. So if you modified the scale outside, let's take a look at the altitude production. If that scale is modified, you will need to modify the scale, or you may need to modify the scale within the material for the cube. And it's automatically going to assign just a grayscale map to whatever you have. And we're pretty much ready to go, ready to render. There's just one thing I'm going to do to take care of the outside clipping. Now, if you need a perfect match, then you may not want to blend this because you're going to need to crop it. But I'm going to get relatively the same size that I need. I mean, if you're converting a scene over, then actually I would keep the ground as being a different color and having that outside area, because then you can crop it properly. But otherwise, we can just zoom in and kind of approximate it. We should be able to get it really good match. The bigger the terrain, the more likely it is you're not going to be able to get an exact match, and you might want to just give yourself a little leeway so you can crop it out. So I'm just going to open up the render settings, and we can just take a look at a quick render really quick. and just see what it looks like. And actually, there is one thing I do need to do just in case, and that is turn off the procedural terrain to render, so hide it from the render. It didn't look like it affected anything, but just to make sure that it really isn't going to cause any issues. If you're using or have access to AsLFX Snowflake, which is host of metanodes, there is an automatic setup for this. The tool, we can select that top camera, and this is to control the camera. So how we use that is we add in, it's a dynamic node called Terrain Previewer Camera Controller, and what you can do is select object or terrain. So we're going to select the cube size and the cube's position, and this is going to lock the X and Y, not the up and down. That is adjusted differently. And because we're using a normal object, it is going to qualify as a procedural. Really, in earlier versions of version 7 mainly, the size between a standard terrain and a procedural terrain had different outputs, so if you were connecting it to different terrains, there were different settings. Procedural applies to all different objects. So this should lock us up automatically to the object within range. And we shouldn't have an edge or a pixel edge at all. It does look like there's a little bit of a shift in there, which I think might be in the procedural itself. Because when I go and take a look in a different viewport, it does look like the camera is matched up the way it should be. We might want to do a little bit of a shift because this was intended for terrains. I'm going to go to the options and turn off the center views on objects selected in the world browser. And that way we don't lose our control, so we can see our adjustments. And I'm going to change the display color of the cube. So going back to that top camera, editing the graph, and that is pretty amusing. I did forget to connect the terrain previewer to the outputs, which is why it wasn't perfect. So we'll connect position to position, and one thing I know is wrong is the orientation. By default should be set to 180 on the Z. So 180 on the X, 180 on the Z. You can open this up and modify that orientation. And we can connect our orientation and also connect our focal. So I did forget to connect it, which is why some of the settings weren't correct, which is why we also probably need to set this to true dimensions for the cube size. And now it's going to be really, really close. And we just need to shift it, because it is set to the center. And our cube size is linked to the terrain. So what I want to do is use a math node, vector operation, decomposer 3, copy, paste, add in composer 3, connect the X to the X, the Y to the Y, version 7, and I believe all the version 7s and earlier, these were referred to as input 0, 1, and 2, and not XYZ. That was changed recently. And we're going to add a constant node to control the z-scale and set that to a value of, let's just do 2, and connect the z to that, connect decomposer to the external dependency, and connect the size to the composer. And that way our z-scale is reduced, and we should get a much better match. So now that is locked in place correctly, now that it is connected. And it looks like it's showing up okay. And I don't see any pixel edge or anything else. I really think that is the fractal, which is why we see that offset. Or it's just the fact that view was cropping out or not allowing me to scroll all the way over. So we can see the perfect match for the terrain. So if you have Snowflake, you can use the terrain preview camera controller in order to lock to an object automatically. Great for rendering stuff like this out. So this is a very low resolution map. There's a couple of things we need to also change before we save this image out. We need to open up the render options, and we need to turn off natural film response. That is going to destroy it. Also want to make sure auto exposure is turned off, because we want all of the information as possible for the output. Even though the color is shown as an RGB value up to 255, from 0 to 255, the in-between values will be represented in color in a 32-bit pass, which is automatic. So now we can render this, setting our resolution. I've noticed in some versions the really large images as an EXR can have problems when you're creating a procedural terrain with an 8K render with an uncompressed HDRI or EXR. So for this version, I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to render out a 4000 by 4000, which is technically the size of a little bit smaller than a standard terrain. So actually we'll go ahead and bring it up to 4500, just so we can go a little bit over that max value. We can render this out, which is going to render very quickly. So here we can see the final render. And of course, this is previewing the 8-bit version. 32-bit has such a huge dynamic range that it's not really able to be all displayed at once. That's going to be really a matter of import or modifying within an image editor. And what we're going to do is save the color image out. So I'm going to call this terrain bake _01 and select the EXR format, which I like the best. Go to the options, make sure that use alpha is turned off. Otherwise, it's not going to save anything that's useful. You can choose your pixel types, whichever one you want to use, and whether or not you want to compress the image. I'm going to stick with no compression because I want the most information possible. And we also want to override the gamma to 1. If the gamma is set any higher, it is going to change the elevation and change the overall output, which we don't want to do. So we'll save this out. Now this is going to be a fairly large file as uncompressed. It's also going to have the best information in it. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and save out this scene. And that way, at any time, we can now take a terrain, load it into this scene, replace the current terrain, or just use the dependency from that terrain and assign it to the cube. And that's all you need to do. Just click render, and that's all you need to worry about. So now, if there are any additional variations you want to have of this, say a contrast variation, or a variation where there is a different mixing between the amounts. So it's not just the altitude. You could also go in and pull out any individual functions, modify it, and just basically keep your scales the same, and just change the combiner nodes. Then you can re-render that out and have an image that you can use to control a different set of material, or even start mixing them with terrains. to get some nice fast renders. Now, I've gone ahead and opened this up in Photoshop so we can take a look at the information, and also modify this in order to convert it over to 16-bit. At the moment, that is necessary because if you load in an EXR that's 32-bit of this scale and use it to control especially a procedural terrain, and although the scene will appear to work correctly, you can save the scene. Once you reopen it, view will crash immediately. That's with version 8 and 8.5. With future releases, that should be or shouldn't be a problem anymore. So if you happen to be watching this after a newer version is released, you should be able to do or use the 32-bit no problem. But at the moment, we need to use a 16-bit TIFF file in order to control elements. But the reason I wanted a 32-bit to save the EXR is so that it can be customized within Photoshop to the extreme and pull out as much detail as we need based on the elevation. And 32-bit is really one of the only ways to avoid the harsh pixelation or sort of solarized effect. So in Photoshop, I'm going to convert this to a 16-bit image, which is also going to reduce the file size drastically. So we can go to Mode and select 16-bit channel. Actually, first, what I think I'm going to do is Control L to open levels and set it auto. Actually, I am going to cancel that. Go back to levels. I don't want any clipping. It may have brought some clipping, so we just need to pay attention to where that last point of the white is, because there's very few areas that are that white or that high up, but we don't want them cut out. And the black too, same thing. So we're just going to very minimally take that in, just because there is a larger cutoff from the outer edge to any of the low points, just to reduce this as much as possible. Now we go over to the 16-bit channel, and we can adjust our gamma. And you can create your contrast this way, depending on how you want the altitude to be. For an exact duplicate of what you have before, you can leave the gamma at 1, and that'll pretty much give you the same output. But if you want to create something a little higher contrast, you can change the gamma and the exposure. Now what I was talking about, it might be hard to see with some of these areas, is the preview of when you're adjusting this will show sometimes these bands that show up between the areas and the gradients. Really aren't showing up a little bit right here, but it's probably going to be difficult for you to see. Those disappear once it's converted. It's just part of the preview. So I'm going to set this to, say, 1.5, maybe 1.8. Click OK, and it's going to smooth everything. It's going to look really nice. And if we want to pull out any additional elements, well, the first thing I'm going to do is Control A to select all, and then we can copy it, go to New Document, and then paste it in, or under History we can just create a new document from the current state. Go back to the EXR version and delete that levels, and now we can extract more information, convert this over to 16-bit. And if we want to pull out maybe some higher contrast areas or detail from a lower area, if needed, you can kind of fine-tune this to create different contrasts that you can overlay on top of each other. So let's create something that's a little bit sharper. by reducing the gamma quite a bit. Let's do 3.5. Now just set the exposure to 0. Click OK. And this I'll just Control A, select all, Control C to copy, and then Control V to paste a new layer. We can also convert this, go to Image Mode, set Grayscale, not going to flatten the image. So now if we wanted to mix these together, we can use the different mixing modes available. 16-bit has a lot less restriction than 32-bit image for running filters. There are quite a few filters that will not be available. But we could still work at an 8-bit mode to filter certain aspects of this image and then overlay that on top. We could also just blend these together, maybe to get a little more contrast, but without really losing our information that we want. So it's a little bit of a harsher contrast than it was before, but it'll produce a nice image. Like I said, for an exact match, just keep that gamma around 1. But we could use this to now control a terrain and also control not only altitude but also material. In the same way we had that noise before, but we've got a nice highly detailed image where we could render out something even larger if needed. And like I said, that's why it's dependent on the scale of the scene and how much detail you need, how close you're going to get. Obviously, if I'm going to get really close to one of these areas in here, I'm going to want to extract or create a separate image for that specific area and use a different terrain. That we can get more detail out of it. So now I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I already have a couple of versions. I'm going to call this op-2 gray. I'm going to turn off layers because I'm just going to use a flattened version of this. So 16-bit TIFF as a copy, save it. Use the LZW compression. Click OK. And I'm not going to save changes because I do want to keep the original EXR. And the file sizes, if you take a look, the EXR file is 231 megs, and this new version just saved out is 15 megs. Makes a big difference. You lose a lot of information, but at the moment, as I was saying, it is really the only way. So we can now add in terrain, turn off zero edges, right-click, reset the altitude reduction, edit the function, add in a projected texture map, and load in that image, selecting the op-2 gray, override the gamma because we're using this for altitude, and connect to our altitude, change the mapping mode to flat vertical. Because we're in a parametric mode, it will automatically scale this within the extent of the terrain. We're also going to turn off the MIP mapping, which I don't think is really going to apply to this, but just in case, we don't want any reduction. We want full quality because it's a pretty lightweight texture. Interpolation type by cubic. Click OK. We can scale this down, and now we have a baked, basically a baked terrain that runs still as a procedural terrain, which means we can still use the function editor to mix other images together and have still a very efficient and customizable terrain type. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render. Go ahead and change this over to 16 by 9. Render a little bit larger. Overall, that looks really good, and it rendered in 12 seconds, which is a bonus. The procedural terrain would have to be calculated and takes up, well, procedural terrain with the original noise function would need to be calculated and processed. This is obviously going to be a much better solution for animation, but also adds more options and the availability to export larger than 4K terrain without having to break it down. So we see some finer details because of the way I modified the contrast. for the most part, it looks pretty good. The conversion worked well. There's only a few areas where some of the banding shows up. I do want to note that that luminous or the luminous layer that we had before that was linked to the slope. Well, it's probably going to work a little better now. Although some of the details will be lost because there's not as much geometry as there was before. For the most part, it shouldn't be that big of an issue. It should match up really well. So now we can also go to the procedural terrain, edit the material, edit the function, and we can either use a custom dependency so that we don't even have to reload the image in. So if you have version 7 and higher, you can add a custom output, custom dependency, and grayscale output, and call this alt for the altitude, even though you could just directly connect to the altitude. It is nice to use the image for certain things. And then let's go ahead and connect that to, we'll add an output node and connect it to our diffusion, which is down at the bottom. So add input node, external dependencies, switch that over to the procedural terrain, select that alt, connect to the diffuse, and because we want to modify this to not go too dark, we're going to add in, actually that blender not connected to anything would actually work pretty well. But I do want to manually do this with a map so I can really define it. And set our lower range to, let's see, negative 0.5, and our upper value to 0.6. And then we could also use that as a bump. Why not? Set it to 0.5, render it out, and it's going to start to look a little bit better. So it's very clean, has a lot of detail. We can, of course, now add in some simpler noises if you want to mix it or create some new image maps. Go back to the render bake scene and maybe customize those materials a little bit more. We could also modify the terrain to mix with this that image once again. Kind of a cool thing you can do. I'll show you really quick. Is take the projected texture map, add in a blender, duplicate that texture map by adding it in again, change the scale to 0.5, and we're set to repeat, and it is a seamless texture because the edges are all black and canceled out. So we don't need to switch to the mirror mode. If it was not seamless, if you were rendering something out without the edges subtracted, you could switch this over to tiling mode, mirror, and then it would become seamless. So now we're going to have 4 of these showing. We're going to blend these together, grayscale. That'll work with the way it is, set to 0.5, blend, reconnect the altitude, output, and take a look at a more complex texture. Now, obviously, because of the blending and the smoothing overall, we do have some strange-looking areas where they're kind of going in and out, and maybe a little bit too much curvature. So if we want to modify that to make it a little bit better, we could switch this over to the minimum or the maximum. Well, let's go ahead and try the maximum. So the max blending mode, just set to 0.5. It's still going to give us some more detail and look pretty good, and then that is still going to pass over to the material. If you are using version 5 or 6, you can just load that image directly into the material, making sure that you are using the object parametric mode, which will lock it in, and just kind of duplicate the settings or copy the altitude function, which will automatically load in your images, and now use those to control the terrain. And if we need to, we can raise that up above the ground plane because it was intersecting. Maybe scale it up a little bit. But that's a really, really efficient baking method, better than standard terrain, because you still have the option to control it as a procedural. Also, the ability to edit it as a function. but it's a really fast rendering image, which is great. We could also use this image to, say, create a ambient occlusion layer. And that we wouldn't even need to use View for. We could go into Photoshop and create a pretty decent ambient occlusion a couple of different ways. So if we want to create a fairly accurate ambient occlusion map, I'm just going to do this quickly. We could really create a very accurate one, spending a little more time, but I'm just going to do something pretty quick. What I want is to somewhat balance out the image first. A couple of different ways we can do that. We can create some duplicate layers, and I'm going to set it to difference, and now open up blur, surface blur, and where the blur is showing, we can adjust our radius. When there's the difference, it will start to show up. We adjust our threshold, so basically the scale in which it is affecting. Now this is kind of inverted, so if you want something a little more accurate for the final output, you can pretty easily just invert both these layers before opening the blur. But I'll just do that afterwards. So now I'm going to let that process. Control E to merge that down. Create another duplicate of the background. Overlay that on top, and we can invert. And I am going to auto level. Take the layer, the altitude layer, and we could set up an occlusion, invert it, multiply. Another way we can just darken it overall. Also set it to a color burn or a linear burn. And so to get an idea too, to use a bit of Gaussian blur or surface blur again after that initial blur and that merge, because we don't want really sharp lines. And just adjust our threshold to get rid of some of that weird looking stuff in there. And this will work pretty well to represent ambient occlusion. Maybe that one will be a little better. We can also use this as a mask. But this should work pretty well. As is, just a little bit of burn. We are going to set that to a linear burn. Otherwise the contrast is going to be up too high. I'm going to go ahead and merge these down. Auto level, just to make sure that we are using our maximum amount of information. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this out. First I'm going to merge this down so it's just completely flat, and save this as another image. I'm not going to overwrite this. And call this Ambient Occlusion. And then we can use this to add to that diffusion layer. So going into back into View, edit the material, edit the function, add in texture map, set it to flat vertical for the mapping, projected texture map, and load in the AO image. And I did forget to override the gamma, so you can just select the Y, override the gamma, and we're going to mix this together. Actually, we'll do that before the map. Add in a blender, connect it to the grayscale output, Set our interpolation type to bilinear. We could subtract the information. If it gets too dark, then we'll have to make some additional changes, but we could also multiply, which might be ranging a little too high. Or we could just add that information, or blend them. So, a couple of different options. I'll just go ahead and blend it at 0.5. Take our map, and let's go ahead and bring our upper value to 0.8 and our lower value to negative 0.9. Let's just do -1 because we have a pretty limited range. Might as well just max that out to -1 to 1. Should work okay. Looks like I do need to use a little more, or a little darker of a diffusion. I'm also going to increase the contrast a little bit because it is kind of smoothed out more than intended. Go to our blender, and we could adjust the gamma if we wanted to modify that too. But I'm going to blend it at 0.8. Go to our map and set our upper value to, let's say, 1.4, and that'll darken everything overall. Also forgetting that I did create within the altitude that duplicate function. So ratio max, remembering it's just half the size, and also doing the same thing for the occlusion, setting up a blender to blend, or to max, adding in that duplicate, setting the scale to 0.5, connecting that. And that's fairly close. Ambient occlusion. It's going to be difficult to see because there's so much sunlight. Probably would end up darkening it a little bit more. Let's go ahead and adjust to show a little more ambient light in the scene. Go to Sky, Fog, and Haze and reduce the scattering in order to broaden the light around the scene. And it looks like maybe that minimum isn't going to work for the occlusion. Might get a little overlapping. We can fine-tune it. Otherwise, we can just set this to blend. We should be able to still get something that's going to work really well, but making sure we're not really missing anything. It does look a bit better. So I mean, these are rendering extremely quickly compared to before. Obviously, as we add more things to the material, it's going to take a little bit longer, and but we're never going to reach the point where we had all those noises being processed to create the render. And for the most part, this is going to be a good scale for farther away, or even some close-ups. If you're going to get really close to something and you need a lot of detail, then I would highly suggest having a smaller terrain using the builder I showed you how to make earlier. And what you can do is use the same method to bake out larger buildings. It looks like the minimum is causing some weird spikiness in some of the areas, so we can switch over to a different mode, or create another image, clipping, using a filter, or going to Photoshop. A lot of things you could do. I also want to mention that if you don't have access to Photoshop and you do want to use these techniques, Just make sure when you save out that flat render where we rendered from the top view that you save it as a 16-bit TIFF image. So just selecting TIFF from the file menu on the bottom, go to Options, and then choosing 16-bit. And that way you can just use that image. The file sizes will be larger because you're not going to be able to use grayscale. But if you have access to Photoshop, obviously there's a lot more you can do and create some really good looking stuff. Another cool thing is because this is just controlled by an image, we can up that quality boost without any real change to the rendering speed. I mean, it's going to be modified, and already I see the quality improving and the render time overall increasing, but it looks much better. And doubling the time, if it's only 12 seconds, isn't that bad. Another thing you may notice is the way the ambient light is showing. We may also want to connect the ambient occlusion. You can connect it just to the ambient output, so we can add an output, select ambient, and connect to that instead of the diffuse, or use both. So for both, I would want to just connect to that layer in the images I created, and we don't want the output that high because ambient should be a little lower. We're going to switch over to the map, which it automatically created for me, and we're just going to set our upper value to 0, or actually we'll go ahead and we can use 0.1, and our lower value to negative 0.9. If it's still too high, we can shift it by changing the upper value, say 2, lower value to 0, just making fine-tune changes. So that's looking pretty good. And for that render time being 24 seconds, even though we haven't added any color or anything to the color channel or anything, if we stick with images that we're rendering out to control the majority of the settings, you can just keep those render speeds under a minute or under 2 minutes for pretty large renders. And not having to render out an ambient occlusion pass really speeds things up too. You could also render this from above using View's ambient occlusion in order to create a texture, and have View process that without using Photoshop, and it would probably be more accurate. For the most part, this works pretty well. I just want to improve some of the details, and we can add that loom layer, and then we'd have a good working terrain for this city. So I've gone ahead and just used the images, a couple of filters on the dependency to modify a couple of different colors and color maps, and still have fast rendering terrain and a little more variation in here for the color. So all I really need to add is a little bit of bump. And we bring in that luminosity layer that is linked to the slope, or even render that out, having the slope, or using an image to control those lighting, those lights, either using Photoshop or just creating a custom output, modifying the slope, re-rendering it to get what it is that I need out of it. So some really cool techniques here.